But yes, you guys watched Contagion and Outbreak for this. How did the context change the viewing experience?
I thought it was much more horrifying.
It was terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Contagion was much more, much more terrifying for our contemporary situation.
The average person touches their face 2,000 or 3,000 times a day.
2,000 or 3,000 times a day.
3 to 5 times every waking minute.
For me, Contagion, more panic attacks.
I think the difference between Outbreak and Contagion is kind of interesting in terms of, how the realism of each. Like, I think Outbreak's concerned that there's not really that much sense of realism, and there's about 20 years between them. And I think it's pretty graphic, but it's not realistic. So I think whereas I think Contagion really, it's very concerned with being realistic, especially about the prospects for containing and curing the disease and preventing it.
But right now, our best defense has been social distancing. No handshaking, staying home when you're sick, washing your hands frequently.
One of my favorite and most scary scenes in a pandemic film is that movie theater scene in Outbreak where the person coughs and somebody's laughing and it gets sucked into their mouth. And I literally have never forgotten that scene. What would you say realism is often a response to? I mean, when we think about like different trends in the history of cinema, when realism becomes, part of sort of the trend, like if we think about,
I think it's trauma, right? Like, yeah. I think like the great
Italian neorealism.
Well, I was going to say the great moment of realism in cinematic history is Italian neorealism, which is a response in some ways to World War II and also a response to fascism, right? To the trauma of fascism. So I feel like realism is always it's tied to what we were talking about earlier, that when you have this terrible trauma, there's maybe not just so much a recourse to fantasy as a attempt to be realistic, to try to find your way, to get your way through it, and also to experience it more deeply. Like, I think maybe that's what we're trying to, when you're in the midst of a virus, you want to understand what am I experiencing? And so part of watching a film is to understand how am I supposed to feel when I'm in the middle of the virus. And I think that part of what films are doing is teaching us how to feel and what we're supposed to feel. Like, think about the Great Depression films that are kind of like Capra films that are escapist. They're also like delving into the depths of the Depression at the same time. Like You Can't Take It With You. Like, that's still a film about, people not having a job, and if they find a way to deal with it, but it still confronts that trauma in some way.
Yeah, I was thinking that too about Depression films and how we always hear this thing like, oh, people watched comedies and musicals. Musicals were so popular during the Depression era because people wanted to escape. But if you watch the musicals from that time period, they're really also delving into these really difficult topics, and like Gold Diggers of 1930.
I was just thinking about that one. It's all about unemployment.
The Depression era.
Yeah, it's all about unemployment and trauma. And so it's a little bit of misleading to say that they watched it, musicals just to escape in that sense, I think.
It's interesting to think of Contagion as a response to 2008, right? And to the financial crisis. Like, I think
this is about the dissolution, of the economy and looting and all of that. Where do pandemic films fit in genre-wise? It does seem to me that the pandemic films are a combination of the disaster film and the horror film, especially maybe the zombie film or the...
Well, vampire works too, right? Like if you're bit by someone else, it seems very similar.
There's we have this friend, Hugh Mannon, who writes this great essay about Night of the Living Dead. And one thing he says about the zombies is that they're local and that they are predictable. Like, in a zombie film, zombies walk slowly and they walk until World War Z, then they run, right? But most of the decade, zombies walk slowly. And so you still can't shake them, but you have some time to run, right? And it does feel a little bit like that. Yeah. Like, we can see it coming, but we can't avoid it, but it's coming slowly and it's, just still approaching us. And I think that probably is why the zombie film also is popular at the moment.
A disaster creates a collective. Like disaster films all begin with these isolated individuals, and then because the disaster hits, they have to come together in some way.
And of course, in a horror film, it's about the disruption and dissolution of the collective.
There's this kind of utopian moment in the disaster where we're all equal.
Look at their faces. They all look the same.
What's interesting is neither of the famous Contagion films do that. Like they show people more like it becomes this almost Hobbesian war of all against all, where there's a complete breakdown of any kind of social norm. And I think part of the problem is that they don't envision a way of that we could be together while being apart, right? Like, so for them, being apart means you're at war with each other in both of these films. But I think what we're seeing now is people can be apart and feel together, like the way they were singing on the balconies in Italy, but even not that, like just even like you feel like you're doing your part to your community by staying in. I feel like that's a very collective, like this contagion, our disease has created, at least until now, a collective sensibility.